She said it across a table full of people. She said it the way you'd say the weather, or remark that the bread had gone stale. She picked up her wine glass, looked at me over the rim, and said, "You're boring, Mitchell. You've always been boring." The table went quiet. Not completely. The restaurant was loud enough, a Friday night crowd at Henley on Ice, white tablecloths and candlelight, and the kind of ambient noise that fills silences whether you want it to or not. But the 6 people sitting around that table, our friends, 2 couples we'd known for years, and Renee's co-worker Sandra, who I'd met maybe 4 times, they all heard it. I saw it move across their faces one at a time. Paul Decker looked at his plate. His wife Karen did the same. Sandra took a sip of water like her life depended on it. I smiled. Not a big smile. The small one I use when a barge operator calls in 2 hours late and tries to tell me the delay isn't his fault, the one that doesn't give anything away. "Well," I said, 18 years of it, so. Someone laughed, relieved. The wine kept flowing. Renee moved on to a story about a bourbon launch event she'd organized in Nashville, and the table breathed out, and the evening continued like it was supposed to. Creme brulee arrived. Paul gave a little toast and said something about how 18 years is a testament to patience and commitment, and everyone clinked glasses and smiled. Renee smiled. I smiled. We were very good at performing the evening. She held my hand walking back to the car. That's the part I keep turning over. The hand-holding, which was warm and automatic and real in some way, even then, even knowing what I know now. She told me I'd been quiet, and I said I was tired. I was not tired. I drove home with the radio off, which is how I drive when I need to think. We live in East Memphis, 11 minutes from the restaurant on a Friday, 8 on a Saturday. I know the drive the way I know most routes, by time and sequence, not landmarks. I park in the left bay of the garage because Renee parks in the right and always has. I went inside, poured 2 fingers of water over ice because I'd already had 2 glasses of wine, and I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, just looking at the room. The whole house was clean. Renee kept it clean. She kept a lot of things clean and presentable on the surface, and I had spent 18 years being grateful for that without examining it closely enough. I went to my office, which used to be the 4th bedroom before our son Tyler moved to Nashville 3 years ago. It still had a few of his lacrosse trophies on a shelf I'd never moved, not from sentiment exactly, just from the particular inertia that takes over rooms that no longer have a clear purpose. I sat at my desk, opened the bottom right drawer, and took out the notebook. It's a Leuchtturm 1917, black cover, hardbound. I buy them in packs of 3 from an office supply place online. I've been keeping them since my mid-30s, 1 notebook at a time, each one dated on the spine when I started. I have 11 of them on the shelf behind the desk. The current one was started 14 months ago. I flipped to a page near the middle, a page I'd marked with a small star in the margin using a red pen. A habit I have for entries I intend to revisit. Most starred pages get revisited within a week, and then the star is just an artifact, a reminder of something I've already resolved. This particular star had been sitting for 4 months. I looked at that page for a while, long enough for the ice in my water glass to melt most of the way down. Then I picked up my phone and I made 1 call. I was at the river by 5 the next morning. That's not unusual for me. Most people who don't work in freight don't realize how early the work actually starts. Not the paperwork, not the office side, but the operational side, the part where product actually moves. Callaway River Freight has 3 regular barge routes, 2 on the Mississippi and 1 on the Wolf River tributary, carrying general cargo under contracts with 2 federal agencies and a handful of commercial clients. We're not a large operation. 14 full-time employees, a fleet of 4 barges, 2 towboats we own outright, and 1 we lease. The margins are not what people associate with the word freight when they hear it on television. But federal contracts have a way of being steady, and steady, in my experience, compounds into something you can stand on. I've watched bigger outfits collapse under aggressive expansion. I've also watched them do very well. I chose steady. I've made my peace with that choice in the way you make peace with most choices, by not revisiting it more than once a year. I was on the main dock at the Noncana Creek staging area when my operations manager, Darius Webb, pulled up in his truck just after 6. He's been with me for 9 years. Came from commercial trucking and made the transition to river logistics the way some people make transitions, completely, without nostalgia for the prior thing. He saw me standing at the edge of the dock with a clipboard and a coffee, and he said, "You're early even for you." "Inventory on the Pendleton Hall," I said. "Someone miscounted last week." "That was Gerald." "I know it was Gerald." He stood next to me and looked out at the river. The sky was going from black to that particular shade of gray-blue that you only get early on the water, before the sun has fully committed to the day. There's a quality to light on the Mississippi at that hour that I've never found an adequate word for. It makes everything look like it's in the process of becoming something else. He said, "You doing anything this weekend?" "Not much. How's the Pendleton manifest looking?" He glanced at me. Darius is perceptive in the way quiet people tend to be. He's been in my business long enough to know that when I say "not much" to a personal question, I mean I don't want to talk about it, and long enough to know that I'll come to it in my own time if there's anything to come to. He let it go, and we spent the next 40 minutes going through the manifest together, and he was right. It had been Gerald's count that was off, and I made a note of it in the notebook I carry in my chest pocket. A smaller notebook than the one at home. A moleskin pocket size, brown cover. I keep 2 going at once. The operational one for work, the household one for everything else. Numbers, schedules, expenses, reminders. My assistant Cheryl once called it my external hard drive, and I took that as a compliment, even though she hadn't meant it as one. The call I'd made the night before was to a man named Douglas Tate. Douglas is an asset attorney, not a divorce lawyer, an asset attorney, which is a different kind of animal entirely. He specializes in marital property, hidden assets, financial forensics. His firm is on Poplar Avenue, and I had found his name 7 weeks earlier on a referral from a client who'd been through a complicated business dissolution that had personal financial components. That client had described Douglas as someone who doesn't raise his voice and doesn't have to. I had filed that description away. I had not yet explained to Douglas exactly why I was calling him. I had simply said I had a situation, it was financial in nature, and I'd like to come in and discuss it. He'd said, "Fine, Monday works," and I'd said, "Fine." That was it. Quiet. Less than 4 minutes. But I want to explain what that call meant, because the story, if it's a story at all, really starts not at the dinner table and not with the phone call. It starts 4 months prior, at my desk, on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I reconcile the household notebook at the start of every quarter. Not just the current quarter. I cross-reference it against prior entries, look for patterns, flag anomalies. A career in logistics teaches you that errors rarely arrive alone. One miscounted item on a manifest usually means there are 2 more you haven't found yet. Systems develop consistent failure points, and those failure points tend to have a signature. So I look. I've always looked. It's the same attention I give the business, applied to the household, because I don't know how to turn that habit off, and frankly, I've never wanted to. The anomaly I found that Tuesday evening was in the joint checking. Over the prior 6 months, there had been a total of 14 transfers out of the account, all of them to the same recipient account number. which I had written down in full when I first noticed it, 3 months prior to the star, in a notation I'd labeled simply, Verify. The amounts ranged from $600 to $2,400. They were irregular in size, but not in timing. They clustered around the 12th and the 27th of each month, roughly coinciding with the dates Renee typically paid her business credit card. The total across those 6 months was $16,800. I didn't mention it to Renee when I first noted the account number. I told myself I was just verifying. Maybe the account number would resolve into something obvious, an auto payment I'd forgotten about, a household subscription charged to a different method. I gave it 90 days, which is a reasonable window before you escalate a discrepancy in logistics. 90 days, and then you review. When I reviewed, I went further back. The Leuchtturm notebooks go back 14 months at that point. I went all the way to the beginning of that notebook and found the first anomalous transfer, and it was dated 11 months prior to when I was sitting at that desk, which meant the transfers predated even the notebook I was holding. I pulled the prior notebook from the shelf, the one before it, dated on the spine in the handwriting I use only for the notebook spines, which is slightly neater than my regular hand. I went through it with a highlighter and the account number written on a sticky note beside me. And the transfers were there too, starting smaller, 200, 350, then growing in irregular steps toward 800 and beyond. Inconsistent in size, but always to the same account number. Always. I added up the full total on the back of the sticky note, checked my arithmetic twice, and wrote the number in the notebook. Then I sat in the truck for 11 minutes. The engine was off. The parking lot I'd driven to, some errand I'd run before coming home, I don't even remember what it was now, was empty. I reread the same page 3 times, not because I didn't trust my arithmetic, but because I was waiting for the number to become something other than what it was. It didn't. $43,200. I went back inside and put a red star in the margin on that page. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do in the weeks that followed, because people assume things and I want the record to be accurate. I did not hire a private investigator. I did not install any tracking software on her phone or tablet. I did not go through her email, her laptop, her purse, or any of her personal belongings. I want to be clear about that. Not just because it matters legally, but because it matters to me as a matter of character. I do not surveil people. I do not need to. I have notebooks. What I did do, over the 3 months between that Tuesday evening and the anniversary dinner, was this. I continued logging every transaction in and out of the joint accounts with the same detail I always had. I made copies of every bank statement going back 31 months and stored them in a manila folder in the bottom of my desk drawer. I noted every time Renee mentioned her marketing consulting or her personal brand development expenses in conversation, which she did 4 times in those 3 months, and I wrote down the date, the context, and the approximate dollar amount she mentioned each time. Once at dinner, once on a phone call she took at the kitchen table, once in a conversation with her sister that I caught the tail end of in the hallway, and once directly to me in the kitchen, when she said she'd spent $1,100 on a personal branding consultation and was glad she had her own money to manage it. I wrote that one down within the hour, and then I waited. I waited because I wanted to understand the full scope before I moved. I waited because I needed to find the right kind of attorney, and I waited because there was a part of me that was still deciding something, not whether I knew what was happening. I knew what was happening, but deciding how I felt about 18 years of a life with a person who had decided to leave it quietly and with her pockets full. I needed time to arrive at the place where the decision was simply the next logical step, the same way a delayed cargo eventually has to move, and you have to decide how to reroute it. The anniversary dinner arrived while I was still arriving at that place. And then she said what she said, and the arrival happened faster than I expected, And that night I came home and looked at the star in the margin and picked up the phone. Douglas Tate's office had the particular feel of professional seriousness that I appreciate. Not austere, just uncluttered. He had degrees on the wall, but not too many, and a desk with work on it. But the work was organized rather than accumulated. He stood up and shook my hand, and didn't do the things some attorneys do where they size you up in the first 3 seconds and categorize you before you've spoken. He said, "Mr. Calloway, you said financial in nature." "Yes," I said. I sat down and put the manila folder on his desk, and I told him what I'd found and how I'd found it. About 8 minutes. I didn't editorialize and I didn't speculate. I gave him the data in the order I'd encountered it. He listened the way good listeners do, without interrupting, without nodding too much, without that particular brand of sympathetic expression that some professionals put on to signal they're taking you seriously. He just listened. When I finished, he opened the folder and looked through the first several pages without speaking. Then he said, "You documented this yourself?" "I keep logs on household finances. Have for about 8 years." "What kind of logs?" "Every transaction over $50, categorized. Plus I noted any verbal references to expenses she made in conversation when the context seemed relevant." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have any reason to believe the recipient account is a personal account in her name?" "I have a reason to believe it. I can't confirm it." "Okay." He looked at the folder again. "This is a significant amount of money. You said 31 months of statements." "Yes." "And the total you calculated?" $43,200 as of the last statement. There have been 2 more transfers in the past month. I have those written down separately, here." I pointed to the last page in the folder. He looked at that page for a moment. Then he tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. "Mr. Calloway, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Do you know why she's doing this?" I thought about that carefully. I thought about Renee at 30, when we were still new at the marriage, and she used to laugh at the notebooks. Not meanly. She thought they were endearing in a mildly obsessive way, the quirk of a particular kind of man. I thought about the year Tyler left for college, and the house got quiet, and she started spending more time in Nashville for work, and coming home a different shade of tired than I recognized. Not the tired of work, but the tired of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the courage to act on it. I thought about the dinner table the night before, and the wine glass and the candlelight, and the way she'd said boring, like she was delivering a verdict that had been a long time in deliberation. "I think she's planning to leave," I said. "And she's been building a reserve. Pre-divorce asset sheltering." He nodded slowly. "Here's what we're dealing with. In Tennessee, marital assets include both spouses' contributions during the marriage. If the transfers are confirmed to be from joint funds to a personal account she's using to shelter money from division, that's dissipation of marital assets. It's actionable. But we need to confirm that account is hers, and we need to demonstrate that the purpose was to reduce the marital estate, not legitimate personal spending." He paused. "The documentation you have goes a long way toward establishing the pattern. Discovery is where this becomes decisive. If this goes to mediation or litigation, we subpoena her account records and let the numbers tell the story." "That's fine," I said. He studied me for a second. "Most of my clients at this point are furious," he said, "or in tears. You're neither." "I'm a logistics guy," I said. "I'm just trying to move freight from A to B." He smiled at that, which I appreciated. "Then let's talk about what the path from A to B looks like." I was in his office for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because I wrote it down in the pocket moleskin when I got back to the truck. I also wrote, "Retained. Process beginning." 2 words and a period, same as any other entry. Things at home did not change outwardly. That's the strange part of this kind of waiting. You continue living inside the thing you're quietly, methodically dismantling. We had dinner together 4 nights out of 7, which was about our normal. She told me about a new client the bourbon brand had picked up, a regional chain that wanted custom label runs for a promotional campaign. I asked questions, and she answered them, and it was fine. A perfectly reasonable conversation between two people who had been having reasonable conversations for 18 years. We watched television in the evenings. We slept in the same bed. She made a grocery list on the refrigerator door in her particular handwriting, which is loopy and slightly backward slanting, and I bought the groceries because I was usually the one who passed the store. I kept logging. There was a morning, about 3 weeks into this period, when Renee came downstairs while I was at the kitchen table with the operational notebook, reviewing the week's schedules. She poured coffee and stood at the counter and said, "Do you ever think about doing something different?" I looked up. "Different how?" "I don't know. Different. Something that isn't barges and cargo every day." "I like barges and cargo," I said. She looked at her coffee. "I know you do," she said, and her voice had a quiet resignation in it, like she'd already known what I was going to say and had asked anyway, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. She took her coffee upstairs, and I sat there for a moment, and then I picked my pen back up and went back to the schedule. I wrote that exchange down in the household notebook when I got to my office. Not every conversation goes in there. Mostly it's numbers and transactions, but that one I wrote down. I don't entirely know why. It felt like it belonged somewhere documented. The transfers continued in those weeks, 2 more, both around $1,800. I wrote down the dates, the amounts, the updated running total. The total was $47,400 across 33 months. I did not alter my behavior toward the joint account. I did not reduce my direct deposits or change any regular contributions. I wanted the record to be clean. My side of the account functioning exactly as it always had, hers quietly moving money out through a channel she believed I hadn't noticed. Douglas called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was on the dock. He said the subpoena process was advancing, that he'd been in preliminary contact with her firm through channels that gave him a technical entry point without flagging the specific asset concern prematurely. He needed me to compile the full ledger from my notebooks into a single document, every date, every amount, and he wanted me to do it by hand first, so we had the original documentation in my handwriting before any digitization. Handwritten contemporaneous records are harder to dispute than a spreadsheet generated retroactively, he said. We want the origin to be unambiguous. "I'll have it to you by Friday," I said. I went home that evening and sat at the desk for 4 hours. I went through all 3 notebooks that contained the anomalous transfers, 2 complete, 1 current, and I transcribed every relevant entry onto yellow legal pad pages, 1 line per entry, in chronological order. Dates on the left, amounts in the center, my notation in the right margin where context existed. 6 pages. At the top, I also wrote a 1-paragraph summary explaining the logging habit, when I started it, how I maintain it, what notation conventions I used. Not because Douglas had asked for that, just because completeness is how I was trained and I don't know how to produce an incomplete document. I looked at those 6 pages when I was done. 6 pages of yellow legal paper. $47,000 and a marriage. I was not angry sitting there. I want to say that plainly, because people expect anger in this kind of story. What I felt was something closer to a tired and specific disappointment. The same feeling I get when I've given a contract employee 3 chances and I'm writing the 4th notation knowing it's the terminal one. Not rage. Just the sorrow of a thing you wanted to work that didn't. And I also felt something else. Smaller, harder to name. Something about the shape of the whole thing. that she had called me boring, had spent years saying it in various registers, and the most boring thing about me, the one habit she had migrated from charming to pathetic in her estimation, was sitting in a drawer waiting to tell the whole truth. I don't know what you'd call that. I'm not a person who looks for irony, but when it lands that precisely, you notice it. I filed the following month. It was a Tuesday. Douglas handled the paperwork. Renee was served at her office, which she had not anticipated, and which Douglas felt was appropriate given the asset concerns. You don't hand documentation to the person who has been moving money out of the marital estate and give them advance warning to organize their response. She called me 23 minutes after the process server would have reached her. She said, "Mitchell." I said, "Renee." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what is this? What is happening right now? "I filed for divorce," I said. "You'll want to get an attorney. I can read. I know what the papers say. I mean, why? Why like this? Why didn't you just talk to me first? Would you have preferred I talked to you first?" A pause. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, yes, obviously, yes. I thought about the 6 pouches. I thought about the star in the margin and the 4 months of continued logging and the 2 hours and 11 minutes in Douglas Tate's office. I thought about the anniversary dinner and the candlelight and the small smile I'd held steady while 6 people looked at their plates. "Renee," I said, "I think we both know we weren't really talking." She hung up. Not violently. The particular quiet of a call that ends before it's ready to. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, and then I put it on the desk and went back to the operational notebook. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Ochoa, contacted Douglas 2 days later. Ochoa is well regarded in Memphis matrimonial law. Aggressive, experienced, precise about what she'll concede and what she won't. I told Douglas that was fine. I told him I just needed the process to be accurate, and he said that was exactly what he was paid to ensure. The preliminary communications went on for about 3 weeks. Asset disclosure requests, the standard inventorying of the marital estate, back and forth on the business valuation. There's a book value number and a cash flow number for a freight operation, and a certain amount of space between them that attorneys like to explore. Renee's initial financial disclosure was incomplete in exactly the way Douglas had anticipated. The personal account she'd been funding did not appear anywhere on the document. He noted that and did not tip his hand. He filed a formal discovery request for complete account records from all financial institutions she had any relationship with, and they waited. Ochoa pushed back, said the personal account was funded from personal income and fell outside marital property scope. Douglas wrote a very polite letter in response that contained the phrase, "contemporaneous documentation of transfers originating from the joint marital account," and attached, as an exhibit, a single sample page, 1 page out of the 6, showing 3 of the 49 transactions in my handwriting, with dates and amounts clearly visible. Ochoa called him directly after receiving it. Douglas relayed it to me the following day. She had said, "What exactly is this document?" And Douglas had said, "That's 1 page from a personal ledger my client has maintained for 8 years. I have 5 more pages." There had been a pause, and then Ochoa said they'd agreed to mediation. Douglas told me afterward. She moved fast on that decision. He said it meant she'd shown the page to Renee, and Renee had recognized what was on it. The mediation was scheduled for a morning in early November, 7 weeks after I filed. The location was a conference suite in an office building on Madison Avenue, neutral ground, 2 rooms connected by a corridor with a mediator's office between them. I arrived 15 minutes early, which is how I arrive for everything. Douglas was already there with 2 associates, a woman named Kim and a man whose name I wrote down when introduced and then lost track of in the course of the morning, They'd brought 2 banker's boxes and had organized one end of the table with their materials. I'd not seen Renee since she'd left the house, the week after the filing to stay with Sandra. We'd communicated through attorneys since then, except for one text message she'd sent me on a Sunday afternoon. "I want you to know I don't hate you." I read it 3 times and then set my phone down and went back to the operational notebook I'd been reviewing for a Monday morning run. I did not respond. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't be either dishonest or unkind, and I couldn't find a third option in the time I had available. She came in with Ochoa about 8 minutes after I arrived. Renee in person looks the same as she always has. She's one of those women who maintains herself carefully, and I don't mean that critically. I mean it as a neutral observation about consistency. She was dressed professionally, gray blazer, hair pulled back. She glanced at me when she came in, and I nodded at her, and she looked away to the other side of the table. The mediator was a man named Foster, 60s, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of quiet composure that comes from spending years in rooms where people are at their worst. He explained the process carefully. Voluntary, non-binding unless agreement is reached. Goal is to narrow disputes and work toward resolution. He had the patience of someone who has decided, at some point in his career, that equanimity is more useful in these rooms than sympathy. Ochoa led Renee's opening. Standard equitable distribution argument. Tennessee law as framework. Request for 50-50 split of documented joint assets. The personal account she characterized as independently funded from personal income, separate property, outside the scope of marital division, clean and simple, and, if you didn't have 6 pages of handwritten ledger in a manila folder, potentially persuasive, then it was Douglas's turn. He didn't make a speech. Douglas is not a speech maker, and that is something I genuinely respect about him. He picked up a bound document from the table. 41 pages, I knew because he'd walked me through it 2 days prior, and he slid a copy across the table to Ochoa and a copy to Foster. "I'd like to walk through what Mr. Calloway calls his household ledger," he said. He went to the first page, which was a 1-paragraph summary of the logging habit. What it was, when it started, how it was maintained, in my own words, typed up with Douglas's formatting applied. Then he went to the tabbed sections, which Kim had organized chronologically, each tab corresponding to a notebook. Each tab had a summary table at the front, the transcribed entries behind it, and behind those, photocopies of the relevant bank statements with the corresponding transactions highlighted. "Within each section," Douglas said, "you'll see a column of transactions that Mr. Calloway flagged. These entries correspond to outgoing transfers from the joint checking account. The amounts, dates, and destination account number are recorded in Mr. Calloway's handwriting, made contemporaneously as he observed each transaction. The original notebooks are available for inspection and can be introduced as primary evidence if this proceeds further." He opened to a page in the middle section. "The destination account number appears consistently across 33 months. The total amount transferred, as documented in Mr. Calloway's records, is $49,100. He'd updated the total. I'd given him the last 2 entries the week before. The room was quiet. I watched Renee. I want to describe what happened on her face carefully, because it is not what I expected. It wasn't the expression of someone caught in a dramatic sense. It wasn't guilt or anger or the look of someone cornered and searching for the exit. It was something older and more complicated than any of those things. She was looking at the document in front of her. She'd opened it, I noticed, to the middle section, the second notebook period, and she was, I think, understanding something. Not about the money, about the 18 years, about what it meant that every dollar was there. Not because he was watching for her, because he watches everything. Because this is simply who he is, and she had spent years treating that as a personality deficiency, and it had been, all that time, just the man she married, being exactly the man she married. I have thought about that moment often. I don't know precisely what she was understanding. I only know what I saw. Ochoa leaned over and said something quietly to Renee. Renee shook her head, barely. Then she looked up and she looked at me. Not at Douglas, directly at me. And she said, "You've been keeping this since when?" "Since before we were married," I said. "Different format then, but yes." "The whole time?" "Yes." She put her hand flat on the table, palm down. "Not because of me. You weren't. This wasn't because you suspected me specifically." "No," I said. "I log everything. Barge weights, fuel costs, dinner tabs. I log it all the same way." Something moved through her expression that I couldn't name. She looked back down at the document. Then she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, $49,000. And 100, Douglas said. He was not being cruel, just precise. Ochoa said quietly, "Patricia, can we take a 15-minute break?" It wasn't a question. We took the break. Douglas and I stood in the corridor, and he said, low and even, "That's going well." "It's not going yet," I said. "We haven't negotiated anything." "No," he said, "but she understands the landscape now. That changes the dynamic for everything that follows." He was right. The session after the break lasted 4 hours. Ochoa was still sharp throughout. She's good at her job, and she didn't abandon her client's position on contact. She pushed on the business valuation and got a modest concession from Douglas on the cash flow calculation. She pushed on several personal property items and got a concession there too. But on the account, she had almost nothing to work with, and she knew it, and she tried to reframe. The transfers could be categorized as personal expense reimbursements for marketing and brand consulting work Renee had done that benefited their shared household profile. Douglas said, "I'd welcome supporting documentation for that. Invoices, contracts, scope of work agreements, anything that establishes the consulting arrangement and the reimbursable nature of the expenses." Ochoa said they'd be provided in subsequent discovery if mediation didn't resolve. Douglas said, "Of course." Then he turned a page. "I'd also like to draw attention to a specific entry from November of last year. Mr. Calloway noted a conversation in which Mrs. Calloway mentioned directly to him that she'd spent $1,100 on a personal branding consultation and was glad she had, and I'm quoting his notation, her own money to manage it. If these transfers were formal business expense reimbursements, that phrasing is a difficult one to reconcile because it implies she understood the spending as personal, not as reimbursement through an established arrangement. That's a distinction that tends to matter when you're making a reimbursement argument." Renee put her face in her hand for just a moment. Not dramatically. The movement of a person who has reached the far edge of what they have left to spend. She lowered her hand and looked at the table and did not speak. "We reached an agreement by early afternoon. I won't give you all the terms. They're not mine alone to share. The account was included in the marital estate calculation. The division was adjusted accordingly. The house was handled in a way that was financially workable for both of us. No one left the room happy in any simple sense of the word, but no one left it unresolved, which is the most functional version of an ending a mediator like Foster is ever probably hoping for. Tyler called me that evening to ask how it had gone. I told him it was resolved, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Bud," I said. "Like actually fine or Mitchell Calloway fine?" I thought about that. It was a good question and deserved a real answer. "Both," I said finally. "I think it's actually both." He told me he was coming down for Thanksgiving, and I told him that would be good, and we talked for a while about his job, the music he's been making on the side on weekends. A girl he'd mentioned by name twice in the conversation without being asked about her, which I noted without commenting. And we stayed on the phone for 38 minutes. When I hung up, I sat in my office for a while in the quiet, with both notebooks on the desk in front of me. The weeks after that are less of a story and more of a process: paperwork, final documentation, logistics in the administrative sense. Same habits, different cargo. Renee moved her things out on a Saturday in mid-November. I was at the dock doing a year-end inventory with Darius. I had offered to be elsewhere, and she said she preferred it. That seemed right to both of us. I came home that evening, and the house was different in the specific way houses are when they've been reduced by exactly half their occupant's presence. Not emptied. She hadn't taken furniture, just her things, the personal accumulation of a person's daily life. The bathroom counter had gaps where her items had been. Her closet was empty. The kitchen still had everything in it, which was considerate of her, because the kitchen had mostly been mine in practice anyway. I walked through each room once, not looking for anything, just orienting myself to the new configuration of the space. Then I went to my office, sat at my desk, and opened the current notebook to a fresh page. I wrote the date at the top. I wrote the time. I wrote, house cleared, settlement finalized. Then I opened the operational notebook and looked at the week ahead. There's something I keep returning to, and I want to try to say it right. Renee called me boring for years in ways both direct and indirect. The word she used at the anniversary dinner was just the one time she said it plainly. But it had been accumulating in smaller doses for a long time before that, in the way she described me to people at parties, in the particular silence she used when I chose to stay in rather than go out, in the way she sometimes said, "I have a logistics husband," as though it were a disclaimer she owed people before they got to know me. And I understood what she meant by it, or what she believed she meant. She meant that I was predictable, that I didn't surprise her, that the notebooks and the early mornings and the careful attention to every number had added up, in her accounting, to a life that felt insufficient, a life that felt like standing still. But the very habit she called boring is the reason she didn't get away with it. Not a private investigator with a long lens and a daily rate. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic late-night discovery. A notebook, a ledger. The simple, meticulous practice of writing down what I observe, because my career trained me to understand that what is documented is what is real, and what is real is what you can act on. There was no strategy in my logging. There was no lurking suspicion from which it sprang. I kept records the same way I always had, and the records told the truth, the way records always do when you keep them honestly. I don't hold myself above her for having that habit. I don't think she is a villain in the way stories sometimes want to make people villains, all clear motive and cold calculation. I think she was unhappy in a way she couldn't articulate to me, and I think she handled that unhappiness badly, and I think the full shape of what went wrong between us is probably more complicated than I fully understand, and maybe always will be. 18 years of anything. A marriage, a business, a route on the river leaves marks you don't always know how to read until you're standing some distance from it. What I know is what I documented, and I documented everything. Darius asked me once, early in his first year working for me, why I kept such detailed records on operations that were running without obvious problems. I said, because things that are functioning fine are only distinguishable from things that are about to fail by how carefully you're paying attention. He thought about that for a moment and then said, that sounds exhausting. And I said, it sounds like Tuesday. It does sound like Tuesday. It sounds like Monday and Wednesday, and every morning you show up at the dock. before the sun has decided what it's going to do, and you check the manifest and talk through the route and make sure the numbers add up before the cargo moves. That is not boring to me. That is the work. The work is a privilege. I know it's a privilege because I've watched enough operations fail. Through inattention, through overreach, through the particular arrogance of people who believe their systems are running well because no one has told them otherwise, to understand clearly what the alternative looks like. I don't know how to be any other way. I tried once to figure out whether I'd want to be, and I couldn't come up with a version of the answer that made sense. So I stopped asking the question. There's a morning, a few weeks after the settlement, I want to tell you about, because it's where this ends for me, in my own sense of it. It's late November, cold enough to see your breath over the water, but not cold enough to ice the river. I'm at the main dock at Nankana by 4:45. The Pendleton run is going out at 6:30, and I want to walk the manifest myself because there's a new cargo handler on the crew, and I've learned over the years that new people and early mornings are a combination worth watching. Not with suspicion, just with attention, the way you watch anything that matters. I have both notebooks in my jacket. The operational one in the chest pocket, the household one in the inside breast pocket. The household notebook is significantly lighter than it was 6 months ago because I started a fresh one after the settlement. Clean pages. The first entry is the date the divorce was finalized, and below it, 2 items. The total legal fee and a single word, resolved. It's still dark when I get to the dock. The river is running steady, as it does, moving south with the particular indifference that large water has for everything happening on its banks. The dock lights cast an orange-yellow circle on the surface, and the loaded barge sits in it, looking exactly like what it is. Freight, secured, ready to move. One of the crew is already checking the line connections at the far end of the dock. I nod at him, and he nods back, and I walk the manifest line myself, checking each item against the clipboard, marking as I go. Everything checks. The manifest matches. The cargo is secured correctly. The towboat operator, a man named Bryce who's been running for me for 4 years and who takes care of equipment like it's his own, is doing his pre-run check with a focused quiet that makes me glad, again, that I kept him when I had the opportunity to replace him with someone cheaper 3 seasons ago. Darius arrives at 5:15, and we stand at the edge of the dock with coffee and watch the sky begin to do what it does at that hour. The river catches the first gray light and holds it just long enough to show you what's there. The far bank, the tree line, the width of the water between here and there. There's a barge on the far side, someone else's freight heading north, running without navigation lights because the operator knows this stretch well enough not to need them. I watch it for a moment. Darius says, "You good?" I say, "I'm good." And he nods and opens his own clipboard, and we get to work. At 6:30, right on schedule, Bryce pushes out. I stand at the edge of the dock and watch it go. The bow moving through the flat water. The displacement spreading out in a quiet V behind it. The cargo sitting solid and still in the early light exactly where I logged it. Moving exactly where I said it would move. I watch it until it clears the bend and the river takes it around the corner and out of sight. Then I open the operational notebook. I write down the departure time, the manifest number, and the weather conditions at time of departure. Then I put the notebook back in my chest pocket, and I go back to work.